Jim asked me to send his regards to all of you, and I refused. I said asking me to read his paper was one too many. So you can believe that he sends his regard if you want, but you didn't hear it from me. I have the pleasure of reading this because I have never read Marietta Holley. Don't know anything about her, so this is going to be as enlightening to you as it is to me. In my work on Sarah Parton, I urge scholars of American humor to search for more women satirists who followed her. The topic for the 2024 Elmira Symposium, Gilded Age Humor, provided the opportunity to follow up my close look at the most commercially successful woman satirist in the antebellum period, Sarah Parton, with her creation, Fanny Fern, with a look at the most commercially successful woman satirist in the Gilded Age, Marietta Holley, with her creation, Samantha, Allan. I realized, however, that I knew almost nothing about Holley. I guess that makes two of us. No doubt because most scholarship had ignored her. Despite Holley in her day being called the female Mark Twain, no one has tried an extended comparison of the two authors, so even trawling through the commentary on Mark Twain did not help. The two writers do share a basic fact. Like Sam Clemens, Holley published her first books by subscription with the very same company that gave Clemens his start, the American Publishing Company, and was encouraged by the very same man at the top, Alicia Bliss. Focusing just on Holley's first book, My Opinions and Betsy Bobbett's, this talk aims to update her status in the American comic tradition by considering her work within the framework of Judith Lee's Matters of Empire thesis. I want to answer in a preliminary way three questions. One, what is the best label for Holley's comic pedigree? Two, what are her comic tactics? And three, what are her politics? So under the heading of comic pedigree, the marketplace competition for Marietta Holley were the so-called literary comedians, also known as the Funny Fellows. Charles F. Brown, Artemus Ward that is, was the original of the group, the most popular comic writer in the late 1850s and 1860s until his untimely death in 1867. Walter Blair in Native American Humor singles out several important literary comedians along with Brown, while also providing a footnote with 34 more names, including Holley. Holley published 25 books, including collections of short stories and poems, 2 dramas, and 1 book-length poem between 1873 and 1914. Her fame as a comic writer stems in particular from a group of episodic novels that narrate the travels and married life of Samantha and Josiah Allan. Her Samantha books made her a unique force in Gilded Age comic writing because of her efforts in them to promote women's suffrage. Naming her comic pedigree, previous scholarship has placed Holley in the vernacular frontier tradition, which yields multiple potential tags: crackerbox philosopher, Yankee humorist, literary comedian, or funny fellow. Maybe that should be funny female with a PH. Accepting my suggestion of a funny female, all have been employed by subsequent scholars. In addition, Holley was almost certainly familiar with Frances Witcher's Widow Bedott papers, which presents the only other well-known female comic voice written by a woman before Holley, besides Parton's Fanny Fern. Like so many other comic writers publishing in 19th century America, Holley, via scholarship on her work, has been largely defined by what Walter Blair has said, particularly in Horse Sense in American Humor from Benjamin Franklin to Ogden Nash, where he devotes half a chapter to Holley. In that second effort to categorize American comic writers, Blair declares that Holley uses, quote, humor of an obvious and usually time-tested sort, unquote, by which he means Samantha fits into the mother wit stereotype, advanced in the first scholarly effort on American humor, Jeanette Tandy's Crackerbox Philosophers in American Humor and Satire from 1925. Blair's vernacular phrase, horse sense, echoes Tandy's version of the same homespun mother wit figure. Blair goes further in analyzing Holley's comic tactics by emphasizing the political consequence of her use of a time-tested comic tradition, invoking what might be called the spoonful of sugar theory, as she dispenses a feminist medicine for the body politic. Quote, "The propaganda for suffrage was brilliantly handled, and I think that there can be no doubt that Samantha did more for the cause than many hard workers ever accomplished by serious speeches and arguments." That's from Blair. The standard scholarly categories are all useful to suggest how to compare and contrast Holley with other 19th century comic writers. However, they mostly elide Holley's national ambition, and so fall short of fully contextualizing her achievement. Employing well-known comic traditions and their well-worn comic tactics to advocate persistently for a public sphere issue of national import, women's rights. The best tag for Holley, therefore, becomes Judith Lee's post-colonial, which not only acknowledges how the vernacular tradition in American humor breaks away from its English origins, but also implies America's domestic imperium and the subaltern status of women within its political economy, as well as the same subordinate status for other minorities, Native Americans, Black Americans, and so forth. Walter Blair, then, deserves credit for first emphasizing the radical nature of Holley's Samantha books, which has been expanded later by many critics in various ways. Placed within Judith Lee's Matters of Empire scheme, Holley's satire reconnects with the politics of women's suffrage, and so emphasizes gender in Lee's post-colonial category. On to comic tactics. Next, I have some comments, too many for today's panel, exploring how Holley's basic comic tactic, crudely constructed stereotypes, powers her satire. So I'm going to skip rehearsing them except to say this. Holley's comic use of stereotypes focuses on Samantha's husband Josiah as mindless parrot for patriarchal dicta, and her erstwhile friend and neighbor Betsy Bobbitt as mindless parrot for patriarchal dicta from a sentimental woman's point of view. Now, these two figures act as comic foils to Samantha's comic stereotype, the time-honored ironic figure, that's E-I-R-O-N-I-C, that is the mother-wit crackerbox philosopher who combines truth-telling common sense, what Walter Blair calls horse sense, with the behavior of a country lout. Trust me, there are many examples in Holley's first book to flesh out these claims. Now, last, satire and politics. The remaining time goes to judging Samantha's politics, which is to say, how to judge Holley's politics. Samantha repeats her carefully chosen political position at various moments in the narrative. Megamness, or mediumness. Jane Curry calls Holley's politics conservative because supposedly women's suffrage would not affect, quote, sex roles, unquote. In effect, resurrecting Blair, Michael Epp challenges this characterization, claiming Holley's promoting women's political rights rates as radical. I want to suggest today that they're both correct and yet both wrong, and they should have listened to Samantha. Holley advocates an attitude neither simply conservative nor progressive, a contradictory amalgam that might be called medium within a calculus of comic tactics. I again have to condense evidence, and I propose to do so with a brief look at a specific chapter in Holley's book titled Interview with Theodore and Victory. That's the chapter, not the book. Which presents Samantha's meeting with Theodore Tilton and Victoria Woodhull. I focus in particular on the debate Samantha has with Woodhull about marriage and divorce. I will also glance at the penultimate chapter of the book when Samantha meets Horace Greeley, which is the motive for Samantha's trip from her farm in upstate New York to New York City. The dialogue with Greeley about supporting women's suffrage as he runs for president against Ulysses Grant ends with arguably the biggest joke in the book. Samantha and her friend Betsy's meeting with Woodhull also includes meeting Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, as well as Isabella Hooker, four of the most prominent feminists and suffragettes of the 19th century, plus Tilton, Henry Ward Beecher's assistant from 1860 to 1871. In 1874, Tilton files a civil suit against Beecher, accusing him of adultery with his wife, Elizabeth. In the book, however, Holley praises Beecher extravagantly. I must skip details here too. Holley apparently had finished writing her book, which was issued in early 1873, about the same time that Woodhull publicly denounced Beecher in November of 1872, a context that from our vantage point frames the interview with a dramatic irony, for it includes a discussion of Woodhull's advocacy of and Holley's challenge against free love, which Beecher, in effect, practiced. Samantha accuses Woodhull of having two husbands at once, no doubt a claim in the contemporary press. Woodhull says that that is false. Apparently, Woodhull was not married to her second husband in a conventional way, and Samantha scolds her for it. Her scolding sounds very righteous, though in this part of the discussion, she speaks, quote, mildly, unquote. Woodhull had divorced her first husband, but Samantha ignores this fact and repeats the bigamy claim, saying she wouldn't have a second husband in the house with Josiah. When she babbles about troubles enough she has with Josiah alone, because, for example, he goes about in stocking feet, excuse me, that just shocked me. Woodhull interrupts, with her eyes a-flashing, as a sign of the comparatively trivial nature of these troubles. She divorced her first husband because he was, quote, a man that forgot every day of his life that he was a man and sunk himself into a brute. He was a drunk. What would you say to abuse that resulted in the birth of an idiot child? Would you endure such a life? Would you live with the animal that he had made himself? These are facts about the first husband, whom Woodhull married at 15. Their child was mentally disabled. Samantha's answer is not only callous, but contradicts her feminist position against the cult of true womanhood claim that women are angels. Hush up, Victoria, says I. Women must submit to some things. They can pray and they can try to let their sorrows lift them nearer to heaven, making angels of them. A shocking disregard of the circumstances for Woodhull's choices. Samantha says that love keeps her married to Josiah, but Woodhull asks her why she cannot credit others with the same sentiment, ceremony or no, highlighting Samantha's cavalier treatment of an abusive husband. Samantha counters that no one should marry except for love, but Woodhull injects some realism into that romantic sentiment. Some folks marry for a home, says she. Well, they ain't no business to, says I warmly. I'd rather live outdoors under an umbrella all my days. Those are my sentiments exactly. Josiah Allan's wife. Holley here forgets Samantha's earlier arguments in the book for equal pay, which she suggests to Betsy, forces women to marry men they don't love and helps keep unmarried women objects of contempt. When Samantha argues that Woodhull is in the wrong to be married without a proper ceremony, and that she will offer her house for such a ceremony and even pay the minister, Woodhull replies, I don't want any ceremony. I want the only tie to hold me to my husband to be love, the one sacred tie. Samantha insists on the necessity of a standard ceremony. Otherwise, the so-called marriage is a, quote, circus, unquote, and returns to how Woodhull is also wrong about divorces. Here, Samantha sounds foolishly romantic about husbands and wives and disregards the grim truth of many marriages, a general dismissal to complement the particular one she just gave about Woodhull's disastrous first marriage. Despite Woodhull arguing the general case and living the particular one, Samantha remains adamantly against divorces, even though, quote, there are individual cases where there is great wrong and great suffering, unquote. If someone wants a divorce, Samantha has her practical remedy. Says I, when a woman has such feelings, instead of leaving her lawful husband and going round hunting up a affinity, let her take a good thorough puke, says I. In 9.5 cases out of 10, it is folks' stomachs that are clogged up instead of their souls. Says I, there's nothing like keeping the stomach in good order to make the moral sentiments run good. Samantha's country wisdom, horse sense, in this example, sounds like the worst foolish nonsense, treating a wish or a need for a divorce as a stomach ache, to cap off her callousness about Victoria Woodhull's first marriage. Samantha's exchange with Woodhull is unique in a book in which he routinely vanquishes Josiah and Betsy. Instead, Holley offers a real debate about the limits of the suffragettes' demands for change. Jane Curry claims that, quote, the reader knows that Woodhull's arguments are likewise persuasive and that she remains unconvinced, unquote. The description is accurate, but it elides Samantha's callousness about spousal abuse and ignores how Samantha's vaunted common sense and homey metaphors backfire. The argument feels authentic, yet Holley either loses control of her central comic tactic, the crackerbox philosopher stereotype, or deliberately sacrifices it to dramatize the fraught nature of the issues being debated. When Tilton supports the possibility of a divorce, Samantha rebukes him, quote, in almost trembling tones, unquote. Thinking of him as a so-called free love advocate, Samantha cries. Of course, allowing for divorce is not the same as free love. Samantha returns to the notion of true love as a divine creation, but that only ignores the possibility of a ceremonialess marriage. And that has true love also, while also ignoring the grim realities Woodhull brought up earlier. In short, Samantha repeats herself despite obvious defects. Her stubborn rhetoric echoes Josiah's stubborn defense of patriarchy. Holley finishes the conversation with a generous thought, however. Samantha feels eloquent linking true love in heaven. And she says, quote, it seems to impress him as I wanted it to. They both of them have got good faces. Though I didn't like their belief, I liked their looks. They looked sincere and honest, unquote. For all of her self-righteousness in the debate with Woodhull, Samantha's tolerant comment as coda can be read as reinforcing the general scholarly consensus that Holley's politics travel a middle road, mediumness, but it does not erase Samantha's intolerance against the debate. Given abuse from drunken husbands or men irresponsible in various ways toward their families, Holley, ignoring domestic sphere problems in favor of public sphere problems, points to a very real issue for the women's suffrage movement. Holley, emphasizing the public sphere, also suggests how brave she was to be so strong for so long in her support for the movement. Nevertheless, the strict religious context that Holley gives marriage blindly supports one of the pillars of the cult of true womanhood. piety. The label of mediumness papers over the contradictions of Holley's progressive politics. Holley's most revolutionary criticism of the legal system may be her assertion that women should receive equal pay for equal work, says Melody Growlich. Continuing the quotation, if the laws loves women so well, why don't he give her as much wages as men get for doing the same work? Why don't he give her half as much, says Samantha. The progressive nature of the observation about equal pay for equal work and how it forces women to marry out of need rather than love is undercut when Holley refuses to take the next step and support divorce. Mediumness means women's rights, except for the option of divorce, because marriage is divinely inspired. A final point. The main goal of Samantha's trip to New York City is to meet Horace Greeley, the famous editor of what was for some time the leading newspaper in the U.S., who's running against Grant. The meeting with Greeley dramatizes the book's last instance of the basic dynamic of patriarchy versus women's suffrage. For Greeley is on the record as opposing women's rights. Samantha cannot convince him to change his mind. Quote, says he, I honor your sentiments, Josiah Allan's wife. I think you are a firm principled woman and an earnest well-wisher of your sect, but I do think you are in error. I honestly think so. The Creator designed woman for a quiet home life. Quote. Greeley's final argument is familiar. Marriage is God's own institution. This argument, ironically, is Samantha's too. But Greeley then adds the Betsy Bobbitt cult of womanhood point of view. To be the wife of a good man and the mother of his children ought to be a woman's highest aim and purest happiness, just as it is man's highest happiness to have a woman entirely dependent on him. It rouses his noblest and most generous impulses. It moves his heart to do and dare and his arm to labor, to have a gentle being clinging to his manly strength. The trope of woman as a clinging vine is Betsy's rhetorical wheelhouse, and it provides the opening for her to speak up. And of course, she immediately says that she heard Mrs. Greeley was not well, and if she passes, would he consider marrying a poetess? That is her. Terrorized by her forwardness, Greeley says, no, he would not marry a poetess. Then Betsy asks for a lock of his hair, which was also her tactic in the earlier scene with Theodore Tilton. Now, in the encounter with Greeley, he remains adamant about not surrendering any hair from his balding head, so Betsy leaves in a huff. Her performance of the spinster, over-eager to marry, however, has been much too up-close and personal, and so he finally compromises with Samantha. I have been sincere, Josiah Allan's wife, in thinking that matrimony was woman's only spear, but the occurrences of the past 25 or 30 minutes has convinced me that women may be too zealous at carrying out that spear. I admit, Josiah Allan's wife, that any new state of public affairs that would make woman more independent of matrimony, less zealous, less reckless in handling that spear, might be more or less beneficial, both to herself and to man. Samantha cannot convince Mr. Greeley to alter his position on women's rights, but Betsy, the ridiculous advocate for the cult of true womanhood and its fetish, the angel in the house, can. It's the best joke in the book. Thank you.